Where do you think you're going? State your name and business in this city at once.
History's strange. It's alien. And it won't give us what we would like to have.
Hour 3 of our Tuesday program brought to you by O'Galley Electric. Headline at BillMick.com. Who's the boss? Well, in this hour, Dave Bowman's the boss, because if it's Tuesday at 8 o'clock, it's Dave Does History. Always appreciate the work Dave Bowman puts in on that. Dave, where are we going this morning, my friend?
Just a real quick aside for just a moment. Last hour, we're talking about vaccinations. You know, George Washington ordered, made the entire Continental Army get vaccinations against smallpox. And in those days, they didn't do it by needle. They did it by knife. So just something to think about when you're worrying about those things.
Be glad we have the options we have.
Yes. By the middle of September of 1776, the Declaration of Independence is about 2 months old. And those magnificent words, which had been approved in Philadelphia in the heat of the summer, were now being tested. It was an extraordinary declaration of principle. But the problem is that principles do not win wars, and they don't hold cities. They don't stop cannonballs. They don't move supplies. They don't prevent frightened soldiers from running away when the enemy comes ashore. And by the middle of September, the revolution had reached the moment when those bold promises of July were colliding with the physical reality of war. That collision would take place on the island of Manhattan, where George Washington's army had retreated to after the Battle of Long Island, which we talked about last week. The British possess an enormous naval force, a professional army, and they completely control the waters surrounding New York. Washington still holds Manhattan because Congress told him to, but the position was basically becoming impossible. To the west lays the Hudson River. To the east, you've got the East River. British warships can move troops wherever they want to at will, and Washington's army was stretched along miles of shoreline trying to guess where Howe would strike next. Now, Washington understands this danger. The question is whether or not he could evacuate the city without allowing his army to become trapped. But there's another question as well, and that's very simply this. Should New York City be left behind, standing and intact?
We find out in just 60 seconds on WMMB. So, options, Dave, being leave the city intact or burn it down?
Well, that's surprising, isn't it? Because some Americans believed that if you couldn't hold the city of New York, you should destroy it. New York had docks, it had warehouses, homes, workshops, shelter for thousands of British troops. And if you burned it to the ground, you would deny those resources to the enemy. This is the scorched earth idea. Oddly enough, John Jay and other influential New Yorkers, John Jay, by the way, being one of the leading Federalists later on, are very sympathetic to this idea. The argument's harsh, but it's simple. It's very Sherman-esque. War is hell. It's better to sacrifice the city than to allow it to become a permanent British fortress. But the Continental Congress, because it's Congress, rejected that idea. New York is American property, Congress declared, and it should not be destroyed. And now Washington accepted that, even though he did not necessarily agree. And on the morning of September 15th, the British began their assault at Kips Bay on the eastern side of Manhattan. British warships moved into position. They began to shell things, smoke rolling across the water, and the British soldiers began coming ashore. The Americans that were waiting there were not hardened veterans. Most were militia. They were exhausted, frightened, badly organized. They'd already retreated from Long Island, and they were fully aware that the British army advancing towards them was easily the finest military force in the world. So when the British landed, the American line collapsed. Men abandoned their positions and just ran. Washington did what he could. He rode to the scene. He found his soldiers running away. He tried to stop them. He shouted. He cursed. He reportedly even struck a few of the men who were fleeing with the flat side of his sword. It was one of the rare times in his public life that Washington completely lost control of his temper. And that image is, of course, worth consideration. We usually remember Washington as this marble figure who is calm, dignified, and almost impossibly restrained. But at Kips Bay, he was watching the destruction of the entirety of the revolution. His army was disintegrating, and British troops were coming ashore. New York City was going to have to be abandoned, and the entire cause could end right there if the British could move quickly enough to cut off the American retreat. Washington reportedly remained dangerously exposed as soldiers fled past him. His aides finally had to pull him out of there, say, "Get away from here," before the British could actually capture him. That afternoon could have been the end of the American Revolution, or at least as we know it. But for some reason, General Howe did not close the trap. Once again, this General Howe, who was reputedly not anti-American, took a pause. He believed that the rebellion might still be ended through a combination of military pressure and political reconciliation. He wanted to defeat Washington, but he didn't necessarily want to destroy him. He continued to hope that a decisive demonstration of British power could persuade Americans to abandon independence and return to the King's peace. But there was also a more practical reason. British officers and soldiers had stopped at the home of Robert Murray, a prominent New York merchant, and his wife, Mary Lindley Murray, decided to throw a party. Several of the officers were invited, food, conversation, wine, and whether or not she was deliberately delaying them or not is still questionable, but it's become part of the legend of the Revolution. Mary Lindley Murray's party, yes, it slows everything down. While the British officers are refreshing themselves, thousands of American soldiers are able to retreat north. Now, among them was Israel Putnam. He was the Connecticut general whose men were still in lower Manhattan. He led them up the western side of the island, moving along roads that allowed them to avoid the main British advance. By nightfall, Washington has escaped to the heights of northern Manhattan. Americans had lost the city, but they had saved the army. And that distinction would become one of the central lessons of Washington's command, that Fabian strategy. Cities could be surrendered, territory could be lost, battles could end in defeat, but the revolution would survive as long as the army, the Continental Army, remained in the field. Now, Washington hadn't quite figured that out yet, but New York was teaching it to him. The British would enter the city of New York as conquerors, and to the loyalists who lived there, this meant deliverance. Men and women who had endured intimidation, confiscation, political pressure from the patriots were very happy. They welcomed the return of royal authority. Some had been driven from their homes. Others had just concealed their loyalties while waiting for the king's army to return, and now they were able to emerge openly. For the patriots who remained behind, the occupation was bringing uncertainty and fear. New York is no longer governed as an ordinary city. It's become a military garrison crowded with soldiers, sailors, refugees, prisoners, merchants, loyalists, and of course, these displaced citizens. Civil government not yet restored, so martial law rules. Now, the British hoped that New York could become the center of a restored royal America, but instead it becomes something stranger. Part fortress, part refugee camp, part prison, part military marketplace. The contrast between a British expectation and American reality could not have been sharper. General Howe established himself very comfortably, continued issuing orders. He offered pardons to Americans who would lay down their arms, and he still imagined that the rebellion might be brought to an honorable conclusion. He had defeated Washington, he had taken New York City, his fleet controlled the harbor, but the Americans would not surrender. They withdrew back to Harlem and began preparing for the next heights. On September 16th, one day after the catastrophe at Kips Bay, American and British forces would clash near Harlem Heights. It was a small battle, especially when you compare it to others, but the Americans managed to stand their ground. And Washington's soldiers, humiliated the day before, fought with discipline and determination. It was not a strategic victory, but it did send a message. This is not going to be easy for you, Britain. It mattered because the revolution is entering a new stage. The Americans are no longer fighting merely to protest taxation, defend colonial rights. They were declared independence. Now they were fighting for that. There's no easy path back. Meanwhile, New York remains under British occupation. New York is a different city than it is today. In the 18th century, a single overturned candle or untended hearth could destroy an entire neighborhood. They're wooden buildings. They're close together. They're warehouses full of tar, rope, oil, timber, and all sorts of combustible material. And the church bells that would sound the alarm had been removed, Bill, for making lead bullets.
Mm-hmm.
The atmosphere is becoming increasingly tense. The British are concerned about this. All of this is adding up. And into all of this wanders a school teacher who has decided to be a spy for George Washington. He only has one life to give, and it's the middle to end of September of 1776.
Dave Bowman joins us for our weekly dive into history. Pay attention, there will be a test. Nah, there won't be a test, but you will be held accountable. Bill Mick Live.
So, Dave, let's get back into this battle for which ended up, well, New York is under the control of the Brits. And now we decide to get radical. What's going on?
As they walked into New York, as the Americans are watching from Harlem Heights, remember, New York City is much different in 1776 than it is today. It's a very small physical city, clustered right mostly around the tip of Manhattan. So some of these names will sound familiar to us, and you'll be like, well, that doesn't seem that far away, but it really is in 1776 terms. The Americans are holding Harlem Heights, the British are occupying New York City, and the British troops that are wandering around through here keep finding things that make them suspicious. They keep finding preparations in abandoned buildings, fire-starting materials all over the place. And, of course, Congress had said, no, don't do that. But Congress is in Philadelphia, and we don't necessarily have to agree with them. The British were concerned about sabotage while the American troops were watching from Harlem Heights. And into this mess, as I mentioned, walked a spy by the name of Nathan Hale. Remember him? He wanders into New York City in mid-September of 1776, just in time for something to happen. Just after midnight on September 21st, flames broke out near the southern end of Manhattan. The wind happened to be blowing very hard, and within moments, the fire began to spread. But there was no alarm. Why is there no alarm? Because the Patriots had removed all of the church bells to melt them down for bullets and or, sabotage the whole thing, one of the two. At first, it probably looked like an ordinary building fire, but that's not unusual. 18th century cities burned with pretty much regularity. Normally, though, you would hear these church bells ringing throughout the city. People would grab buckets, form fire brigades, but those bells were gone. So instead of the bells, there were just voices. Fire, fire. Maybe even in the theater. But by then it was already too late. Stiff wind coming off the harbor turned what might have been a manageable blaze into an inferno. And the flames began to race northward, jumping from rooftop to rooftop, embers blowing hundreds of yards ahead of the fire, igniting buildings that had not been touched by the original blaze. Within minutes, the British occupation changed from celebration to pure panic. Soldiers were abandoning barracks to fight the fire. Sailors from the Royal Navy ships rushed ashore carrying buckets. Civilians desperately trying to save anything they could. And the city becomes absolute, total, and complete chaos. Imagine trying to evacuate your home while soldiers are marching in every direction. Horses are screaming. Carts are overturning. Smoke is so thick you can barely breathe. And the burning shingles are raining down upon you. That is what New York has become on this night, September 21st, 22nd of 1776. One eyewitness describes the entire streets disappearing behind walls of flame. Then Trinity Church catches fire, and that great steeple becomes a giant torch, visible for miles. It eventually collapses into the fire below. Nearly a quarter of the entire city is going to be destroyed. 500 buildings are going to vanish. Today, if a quarter of Manhattan disappeared in flames, you'd hear about it for months. In 1776, though, it just became another chapter in the American Revolution, and it's become almost a forgotten story. Of course, the immediate question begins, in the immediate aftermath, everybody begins off asking the obvious question. How, Bill, did this start? Remember that guy walking into New York? Nathan Hale? How did it start?
So Nathan Hale came into town. He make an announcement on his way in, Dave? Was he sneaking into town?
No,
Do we know?
He's coming in as a spy for Washington. He's pretending to be a school.
Okay.
And he just happens to show up just as the fire is starting. Do we know he did it? No, we do not. But the British certainly had their suspicions. They believed that this fire was intentionally lit by the Patriots for the purpose of, burning the British out, which is entirely possible and certainly believable. Congress, of course, had said, don't do that. But who knows? Washington filed his official report to Congress that the fire appeared accidental. But privately, ...
Appeared is a great word.
Yes, he would tell a different story. Writing to his cousin, the guy by the name of Lund Washington, George Washington would remark that Providence, or perhaps, quote, some good, honest fellow, unquote, had done more for the American cause than the Continental Army had been willing to do itself. That's a fascinating sentence. He couldn't state publicly that American patriots may have destroyed their own city, but privately he is not at all upset by the possibility. If the British couldn't use New York as comfortably as they expected, that benefited the American cause. The fire may have destroyed American property, but it also destroyed British resources. History, as I often say, is rarely clean or straightforward. The moral lines we prefer often become blurred during desperate wars. The British certainly believed that they had been attacked, and they responded accordingly. British soldiers spread out through the streets of New York searching for arsonists. Anyone suspected of behaving suspiciously became a potential suspect. There are reports of men being bayoneted without trials. Others were hanged from improvised gallowses. Gallowses? Is that right? Gallows? Some accounts even claim that suspects were in fact thrown into the burning buildings. Historians continue to debate the accuracy of every story, but war produces, rumors as quickly as it does bullets. But there's no debate about the atmosphere. The occupation immediately becomes much harsher. The gentleman's war that William Howe had imagined was quickly slipping away. And the officers had expected loyalists to welcome them. Instead, they found themselves occupying a hostile city where they believed rebels were willing to burn everything rather than surrender. There were all kinds of people involved with this, but it kept coming back to this one guy that they caught who clearly was a spy, because as it turns out, despite his Yale education, he didn't really seem to understand what was needed there. And that guy's name was Nathan Hale, who just happened to show up as the fire consumed New York.
Did they capture him on the way into town? Is that how that went down?
Not quite, but pretty close. He didn't last long as a spy.
We learn more as we continue in moments with Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live. 321-768-1240. Let you jump in.
So into all this mess in New York City walks 21-year-old Nathan Hale. 21, Bill. He's a Yale graduate at 21.
He's still a kid.
He's a school teacher, and Washington needed somebody to go behind British lines and gather intelligence. Nathan Hale volunteers. It's a dangerous assignment. We need information about the British troop strengths. We need to know their fortifications, future plans, and information wins wars. And unfortunately, Nathan Hale might have been one of the worst people to pick for this because he had no training whatsoever. Today, we imagine secret agents carrying coded messages, false identities, very Jason Bourne, visible ink, all that stuff. Nathan Hale had none of that. He actually carried a notebook with sketches and notes in it, which isn't going to get you very far.
To do. Yeah.
He had no organized intelligence service, none of that stuff. And something happened. Nobody knows for sure whether he was betrayed or whether he simply made a fatal mistake by approaching men that he thought were patriots but turned out to be loyalists. Doesn't really matter. Either way, he's captured. He's brought before General Howe himself, and there's no lengthy trial. There's no dramatic courtroom, no appeal. Spies get hung. And that sentence came very quickly. The officer responsible for Hale's confinement was a guy by the name of Provost Marshal William Cunningham, who was a loyalist who hated the Patriots with a remarkable intensity. And according to numerous accounts, Cunningham denied Hale the comfort of a minister, denied him a Bible, did allow him to write letters. One was for his brother, another for his commanding officer. Imagine those final letters, if you will. Trying to comfort his family, trying to explain why he volunteered, trying to leave behind something they could hang on to after he was gone. Of course, those letters never arrived because Cunningham just destroyed them, not because they contained any military secrets, but because he wanted to deny the Americans even the comfort of knowing that Hale had faced his death with dignity. Ironically, that had the exact opposite effect. Instead of remembering Nathan Hale through private family letters, Americans remember him through his final words, or at least what witnesses said were his final words, which were, of course, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country," which is almost a word-for-word quote from the play Cato, the Tragedy, which Washington was a huge fan of. Now, there's a very good chance that this happened. I tend to believe that it did because so many Americans did know this play, and because Washington was using that play, Cato, as a motivating factor throughout the Revolution. Of course, it tells the story of the Roman hero who willingly sacrifices himself for liberty rather than to submit to tyranny. To 18th century audiences, Hale isn't simply making an emotional farewell. He is placing himself inside one of the great moral traditions of classical civilization. He was in effect saying, if liberty requires my death, then I accept it. And that becomes more the story than anything else. But while Nathan Hale is being hung in New York as a spy, and many suspect that he had something to do with the fire, no one knows for sure, George Washington has another problem. He has a soldier by the name of Ebenezer Leffingwell, who you've probably never heard of. Days earlier, Joseph Reed, Washington's adjutant, had encountered Leffingwell after he apparently abandoned his assigned position. What happened next becomes unclear. Tempers exploded. Leffingwell pointed his musket directly at Reed and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The gun had misfired. Reed immediately drew his own weapon and fired back. His weapon misfired too. Now, if you believe in Providence, it's not difficult to pause at that moment and say two men trying to kill each other, two muskets, both fail to fire. Washington, however, is furious. His army had nearly collapsed at Kips Bay. Discipline has become his obsession. If soldiers are allowed to just abandon their posts, if others could be threatened, if orders don't mean anything, then the Continental Army will cease to exist. Washington orders Leffingwell executed at almost the same time Nathan Hale is being executed. A firing squad is assembled. Two young men, two possible deaths, one at British hands, one at George Washington's hands himself. But then something remarkable happens. Washington listens to his ordinary soldiers who are beginning to complain. They believe that Leffingwell had done nothing wrong. They also believe that he represented every frightened farmer and laborer trying to survive under these circumstances. Executing him, they feared, would break morale rather than strengthening it. And Washington, unlike Howe, hears those concerns, and at the last possible moment, he stops the execution. Private Leffingwell receives a reprieve. Washington had not suddenly become soft, far from it. Throughout the war, he maintained discipline that he believed it was absolutely necessary, but he was beginning to recognize something much larger. An army cannot function through fear alone. Men following him are not professional soldiers. They're citizens. Voluntarily, they had left their farms, their workshops, their churches, businesses, families. They need discipline, but they also needed confidence that justice will exist. And Washington was beginning to learn that leadership requires more than just issuing orders. It requires understanding the people that you're trying to lead. Nathan Hale's execution and the Leffingwell reprieve happen on the same day. One demonstrates British resolve, the other demonstrates Washington's growing wisdom. Both will shape the American Revolution. When Abraham Lincoln will later speak of the Declaration as the apple of gold and the silver frame made by the Constitution, he explains these things, and September of 76 explains why that frame had become necessary. Ideals alone cannot defend themselves. The Declaration proclaimed liberty, but liberty requires an army, requires discipline, sacrifice, and institutions capable of surviving defeat. The fire that consumed New York, the occupation of New York, the execution of Nathan Hale, the mercy shown to Ebenezer Leffingwell, all these events transformed the revolution. The argument was over. It was no longer a political disagreement. It had become a struggle for national survival. And as Washington stood on Harlem Heights, watching the smoke drift off over Manhattan, he knew that the war had entered a different phase. He would lose more battles, he would suffer more defeats, but he also understood something that General William Howe never quite grasped. As long as the army survived, the revolution would survive.
Continuing, Dave does history on Bill Mick Live. Good to have you along here on WMMB. So, Dave, a lesson I'm pulling out of this, if I'm reading it correctly, is Washington's also learning conventional warfare is not going to win this for the Americans.
As we talked about last week, it becomes a very Fabian strategy, this drawing from the Roman Republic. Not only we have Nathan Hale quoting Cato, but we have Washington learning from the General Fabius, who adopted this same strategy, that the object is the army, not the city. And while New York burns to the ground in many cases, it sends a message to the British that this is not going to go quite the way we think it's going to go. And all of this confluence of events with Nathan Hale wandering into the city. And for the record, I don't believe that Nathan Hale started the fire. There are people who do. There are a lot of other suspects that were charged and executed by the British over this. But the fact remains that this great fire of New York City has become almost completely forgotten. I mean, I can't remember a single lecture, class, or anything that wasn't specifically about this that even touched on the fact that the Americans were able to destroy most of New York City and make it a living hell for the British who were living there. It's an amazing story. It's an amazing series of events, but it all adds up into that Washington learning how to do things. And while the Continental Army remains in the field, the revolution isn't done. And there will be more. We're headed into the winter of 76, folks. We're 75, 76. We're headed into that desperate time of these are the times that will try men's souls. And it's not clear that we're going to win. We look back at it 250 years later and go, it was a done deal. It wasn't. And as New York City starts to wake up after that fire and after they hang Nathan Hale, even the British are starting to realize this should have been the end right here. I mean, We came in here and we slapped them around. We're the biggest army in the world. And it didn't. And that has William Howe kind of going, scratching his head, thinking, how do we get rid of them? Well, it's not going to go as easily as he'd hoped it would. And it certainly isn't going to go as quickly as the British hoped that it would. And it's going to cost them a lot of money.
You know, had the British won at this stage, and let's say, just for sake of argument and a little alternative history, that they had won and they had held the colonies at the moment, changes the country as we know it. But with the expansion across the continent, you'd have to think this was going to come up again and again if the British had won at the initial revolution.
You have to think that would be the case, given the subsequent history of the British Empire and the fact, the way that it broke apart. There was no reasonable way to manage it. And that was the big problem.
No.
It was costing them so much to try to manage this. They never saw it. Same thing would happen later with India and other places as well. So it was, by the way, there's a very good book out available called The Great Fire of New York, 1776.
Oh.
Benjamin Karp. It's a fantastic, it's an easy read, relatively new book that covers this quite in detail, much more than we were able to get into today.
Check out more stories from history at davedoeshistory.org.